Hello and welcome to the Recovery Matters podcast from CCAR, the podcast where putting recovery first is always the goal. Here we present interviews, discussions, stories, and speeches to cultivate the understanding and acceptance of the power, hope, and healing of recovery from alcohol and other addictions. Here are your hosts, Phil and Sandy Valentine.
Philip.
Sandy.
I'm excited about this podcast, as I am by all of them, but I always like learning about new recovery community organizations and work that's being done all over the place.
Well, wait a minute.
Here we go.
I like this. I detect a sign of growth. Do you know what that is? They used to get really nervous when you didn't know the guest and like,
no, sir.
Yes, you did a little bit. And now you're like very curious. That's like a piece of recovery coaching. You're curious about our guests.
I have a healthy curiosity.
Not about all things.
Plus, I just spent the last hour and a half talking to you, so I'm ready for a new voice.
Oh, well, great. So our guest today is Robert Ashford. Robert, would you like to introduce yourself?
I would love to, especially to everybody out there listening across all the different platforms. And it's always great to connect with more in my recovery community and y'all's, our recovery community. But I'm Robert Ashford. I'm the executive director of a recovery community organization here in Philadelphia called Unity Recovery. I'm really excited to just talk about recovery. It's one of my favorite topics.
Well, I'm excited to meet you because you've done a lot of things in recovery in a relatively short period of time, and you're also pretty darn young. I mean, look at that full beard and everything, and just like
remember when your beard was brown?
No, do you?
No, not really.
I remember when I had a full beard, but you know why I don't have a full beard anymore? Because that darn radiation stops hair.
So he's got a little beard envy today.
I do have beard envy.
Yeah, he's into the beard oils and.
So what did you feed your kid today? Was it Cheerios? Because you got some in your beard.
It's usually full of yogurt, Cheerios, or dog food. So,
did you see the look she gave me? That's
it's
not nice.
For later. If you don't have a beard, you're not sure of the prerequisite that you save some of your breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a midnight snack at the end of the day. It's one of the perks.
Tucked in.
Well, I do have to give my Sandy kudos because I remember one time I think we were somewhere, maybe it was even like the casino at one of those shows we went to see, and you wanted me to buy beard oil, and I would have nothing of it. But then, and this is a shameless plug for Dr. Squatch.
Who is not the sponsor.
They make pine scented beard oil that I just love.
You know,
they have some of the best social media commercials too for their beard oils.
Yeah.
I don't use that one, but I have several different beard oils that I was hesitant at first too. My wife got me this very grandiose kit last year with like a boar's head brush and a wooden comb and these different array of manly quote unquote scents. And I use one often now and very much like them. I'm converted, similar to you.
I have pine tar soap from Dr. Squatch that I just love. It's a big black beefy bar that just
in some relationships, the partner tries to choose a scent that might be appealing to their loved one, but that is not the case.
No,
here.
Not my case. I'm pine through and through. I want to smell like the woods. We really divert, so I'm sorry.
Yes, Unity Recovery.
Well, what's that? Do you want to ask him our first question?
Yeah.
We have like a key question for all our guests.
We're not going to say little Robert, though. We're going to say, Robert, tell us a little bit about what life was like growing up for you. And
your earliest?
That's your question.
I like to even go back further because she was just talking about her earliest childhood memories she discovered in a deep meditation of being in a crib. Oh, my gosh. So she was like less than a year old, and she was able to recall that. What's your earliest childhood memory?
So not quite that far back.
Me either.
And it's funny. My wife Ariel, who's very much into yoga nidra meditation, would probably align very similar to that. Exploring some of those not necessarily recessed, but early memories, but that is not my case. So probably, I would say pre-kindergarten. I can remember being in Texas, playing with my dad, who's passed away now, and died when I was younger, but playing in the backyard in one of our first houses, playing with like a T-ball set. I was probably, I don't know, maybe 3, 4 it's a fond memory, probably my earliest one too. I don't remember much prior to that.
Yeah, I would imagine you wouldn't. So what was, you grew up in Texas?
So I was born in Texas, and we were there probably until I was in 3rd grade. So however old someone's in 3rd grade, 7, 8, 9. But most of my early adolescence and what I consider home is Pennsylvania. We grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area in a suburb called Mountaintop. Just, a typical Pennsylvania suburb in northeastern PA. But Dad he was a manager of bakeries. He worked for Weston Bakeries out of Canada. Was in Hazelden, and Mom was a teacher. Have a half brother that lived with us, and half sister that didn't. But I think the pretty typical kind of American experience, right? Middle class, played sports, went to school, got in trouble, and it really began to change after that. But it was good. It wasn't Leave It to Beaver style, but certainly I'd say a fun childhood. I have fond memories of it.
We're not going to let you skate that easily, just like played sports, got in trouble, it continued. So I want to know a little bit about what were your sports?
So all of them, actually. Football, soccer, and baseball were the 3 primary. My dad played in college and ingrained it. I don't know if we really had a choice or not, my brother and I. So
what did he play in college?
Did all of them. I mean, growing up, and God forbid kudos and gratitude to my mom, who probably had to take us to all of those trips, soccer practice to baseball practice, sometimes in the same day. It's that and academics, because she was a teacher, is probably what I remember most about my childhood. Just the kind of rigor of, there was never a dull moment.
What did your dad play in college?
Football. He went to Rice and played. He didn't go anywhere after that, but he grew up in West Texas, which it's football and baseball all the time. But he went to Rice and played. He was a linebacker and studied American history.
Wow. And what did you play? What was your favorite position in all the sports? What did you?
So I was a running back.
Wow.
And on the offensive side, and a outside linebacker on the D side.
And out of all the sports you talked about, what was your favorite position to play? Well, the one you look forward to the most?
Yes, probably baseball was, I would say, if I could have chose one, it's probably the one I love the most. And actually had to stop playing because I got injured in football, the irony of that situation. But I was a pitcher and third baseman, but definitely still miss, I like to play recovery softball leagues now just because it's really fond. But baseball was definitely my thing, and pitching of those positions was the one I loved the most.
What kind of injury did you sustain?
As a rotator cuff. I actually was in the end zone, got tackled, and hit it the wrong way, popped out, ended up getting bursitis, and had to get rotator cuff surgery, which for baseball is kind of a big deal. So the physical therapy never really always took, and I still have pain to this day, but it kind of ended any of those hopes. Not that I was not a prodigy by any stretch of the imagination, so it's not like it ruined my future, but it was certainly a sad time in late teens.
Yeah.
So it's no surprise that Phil jumped on the sports comment, but what I thought of when you shared that series of words was, how did you get in trouble?
Yeah, it's it actually plays into a large part of my recovery. But I mentioned when we started this that my dad died really young, so I was 15. It certainly set off a kind of a series of events and poor decisions on my part, my mother's part. So we've done a lot of work in family therapy, et cetera, and really started turning into when substance use for me started really early on. In large part, in hindsight, didn't know at the time, but was dealing and grieving that loss that didn't get to work successfully in probably more positive ways. It turned to filling that gap and some of those needs and early trauma with substance use. And from 15 to 18, between having house parties and getting the cops called on us and drinking too much, that was really the early form. My mom had left me with my older brother in Pennsylvania so I could finish high school. This all happened get dragged back to Texas after some initial trouble, and just it progressed kind of gradually from there over the next 7 years until ended up getting 3 different DUIs in Texas. Nobody got hurt, but certainly still not a good decision for any of the 3. But that led to my entryway into the recovery community, which was going to treatment after my 3rd DUI, where I got to do a ton of work. It was a state-funded treatment center in Texas called Pine Street. Still remember it. And I got to had a co-occurring therapist that was the first person that ever had me do trauma work, vision boarding, trauma egg stuff. And it was just a whole lot of resentment and anger. Got to deal with stuff like my dad's loss. So while I still think I recovered in spite of the criminal justice system, it was the impetus for at least seeking out treatment. So I have some gratitude for it, but also some reality that it shouldn't have taken that. Maybe I should have gotten some help after my first DUI, but it just didn't really exist. So I'm grateful for the trouble. It's led me where I'm at, and luckily it wasn't overly more serious than it was, but certainly not something that I want for anybody else.
So your mom, after your father died, she moved back to Texas, but you stayed with your half brother to finish.
Yeah, we convinced. I still remember a statement she made in family therapy when I was in treatment. When they bring in family members and have your family therapy sessions, which are great. But after one of those sessions, we were in the treatment center cafeteria, and she made a comment that they don't really write books or parenting for dummies. And she was young, right? She had me when she was 21. I had my brother a little earlier than that, but losing a spouse, trying to raise 2 teen boys. I'm 34 now and have a 2-year-old, and I still have no idea what I'm doing. I couldn't imagine losing my wife and then trying to traverse, this context and environment that is, brand new and you're thrown into. So, she's like, I didn't know what we were doing. And so we somehow convinced her that a great idea would be to let us stay in Pennsylvania. We want to finish school. We're doing so well. We don't want to be ripped from that environment. And, my brother and I are thinking, let's run our own life. We can have our own house and do that with no parental supervision. And my brother was over 18. So my mom, I think, reluctantly agreed because she didn't have any other idea to support us, right? She was just trying to do, I think, what her sons wanted that had just lost their father. So, in hindsight, not the best decision, but I understand it's an impossible place to be in for her. I think we've come over it, but she left us, and everything you could imagine that 2 teenage boys would do without a whole lot of supervision certainly transpired over the next year.
Was your dad's passing sudden? And do you mind if I ask what happened?
No, it's so I don't know if it was sudden for anybody else. He was a smoker, heavy drinker, certainly had an alcohol use disorder that he didn't get support for. It runs in the male side of my family. His grandfather, they all died really early on from bad health, bad habits, and certainly substance misuse. So he died in his mid-50s from he had a quadruple bypass after having several different heart attacks over the span of a week, from how I remember at that age, and then died in recovery. Just the heart had too much scar tissue, et cetera. But for me, I remember middle of the night, mom taking dad to the hospital saying, it's going to be fine. And then seeing him as he went to Temple, got transported to have the quadruple bypass. And I had no frame of reference at 15 of what that might look like. So I'm like, I'll be back in a couple weeks. The hospital's going to take care of him, right? So then next thing we know, we're driving to Philadelphia, and he's passed away. And so sudden for me, certainly. But I think for most other adults, my mom and his family members, like everybody probably knew something. Whether it was that day or a couple years later, like certainly his lifestyle wasn't going to be a long and prosperous and healthy life.
Mm-hmm. So I'm fascinated too about, I know that you're a very powerful and passionate advocate for system change, and your natural tendency is to tie your story into the system and how it helped, but could have been so much better too, and could have done things differently. So we're at the point where you had 3 DUIs in Texas, and you ended up at the treatment center and had your trauma addressed and started work there. Also, your mom was big on education, and I know you're really passionate about research, so much so that tell us more about the story and where your recovery journey led you.
Yeah, and I think it's the the much more compelling part, right? Yeah, and for a variety of reasons, many of which you spoke to, is that it allows that narrative of firsthand experience, which is what so many of us in recovery do, to say, how can we transform this for better so that somebody coming after me can do it easier, can have more readily access. So I went to treatment, as I mentioned, and then, on the off chance, I had no idea at the time what a recovery residence was, had no idea what the different assets and resources could potentially be, right? And like many that are entering into this, but my therapist, the primary therapist in treatment, made a recommendation to go to what they called sober living at the time, and he is now a recovery residence in Denton, Texas, which is outside of Fort Worth, to a place called Solutions of North Texas. So got to spend a year in a recovery residence, really going in, getting to continue on in that process, post-clinical care of being around other young people in recovery. Started heavily working a 12-step program, but some of the real linchpin of what I think is success, which is in spite of some of those failings of the system, because there wasn't really a recovery-oriented system of care around, is really taking some of that. I was younger, certainly internet-enabled, is taking the same vigor I had taken to other elements and wanting to do this and going to find those resources. So Google kung fuing to the end of the day of finding, what are things for young people in recovery, finding at that point what was YPR, which was still in its kind of infancy, called Young People in Recovery. And there wasn't a Texas chapter, so started one, wanting to find and go back to school because I had dropped out, even though I had tried some community college, and so found collegiate recovery programs. So of course there wasn't one in Denton. So all of these things begin to slowly kind of come to fruition from trying to find them myself, right? There was no RCOs there. There wasn't peers that, a lot of the work can be done to help navigate and find these different recovery support services. But I at least found enough information of places like CCAR doing it in the Northeast, and places out in Lubbock, like Texas Tech, doing collegiate recovery programs. So found enough to say, well, shit, these things don't exist. I'm just going to try to create them, right? So we created recovery community in Denton, but being in that sober living or recovery residence environment, providing that relative recovery support and really launching to try to do the rest. So ended up enrolling in the University of North Texas, spent the next 4 years creating and ended up becoming the founding program director of a collegiate recovery program there, which still exists today and serves a couple of hundred students a year. Joining YPR and doing the advocacy elements, which has always been really important to me, to talk about my lived experience and trying to transform the system. But my path has been very different than the participants in recoveries we serve in Unity, because it's a lot of the things that I needed didn't exist, at least locally. I had to work and get connected, thank God for the internet and social media, to people in Philadelphia, people in New Hampshire and Minnesota and Colorado that were doing this work already, that served the saying of shoulders on giants, which gets used often, not in just program creation, et cetera, but there was people that had no connection to me other than our shared lived experience in other states using technology to help support me from afar. And I think towards where I'm at today and my positive outlook on digital recovery support, it's because that was really big for me. Even though it wasn't what we know as digital recovery support today, it wasn't just peer services delivered over video or telephone or all recovery meetings. It was just people socially connecting to me and investing in me for nothing other than it was the right thing to do. And that's the life they lived as recovery advocates and recovery supports individuals and people in recovery in other places. So I'm incredibly grateful. And all of that is kind of, I think the other piece that's important to mention, right, is I didn't know it then, but I know it now, of the only reason all these things were possible was my relative privilege too. I'm not in prison, right? I'm not dead. I was able to do those things at the same time because of access to socioeconomic resources, certainly the color of my skin, so I wasn't locked up. So I don't have any misgivings there. And I think that's what drives me today, is that I shouldn't have to have privilege, access to resources to be successful. And that's, I think a lot of my advocacy is driven by that today. So I think it takes people with that privilege to speak out. Like it should be easier for every single person with equitable access. And 10 years into this journey, that's still not the case. So there's still a lot more work to do. And that drives everything we do today, is that lived experience, but also the realization that it's not typical and it should be.
So definitely want to hear more about that, but you touched on something that's near and dear to my heart because I lead the Collegiate Recovery Community Program at the University of Connecticut. So what were your key takeaways there? Because I hear all the time from adults that I come across, I wish that there had been collegiate recovery when I was in school. Maybe I would have had an earlier intervention in my journey.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting. When I think of collegiate recovery program and more broadly, as I think of recovery now, and the approach that we've always taken is integrated behavioral health recovery. And part of that's because I'm in recovery from co-occurring disorders. I have bipolar disorder as well as several unique substance use disorders. But when I think of recovery support, and this has been from early on, again, from my own experience, is that recovery support looks very similar, whether you're in mental health recovery, substance use recovery, or others. People connecting with people and getting recovery support is very similar. So when I think of the collegiate environment, it really took that element of integration of these different elements of mental health and substance use, but also what the work that our CEOs were doing. That from my perspective and what we built and why it can work is that a college is just a community, right? Even if it's in a town in its own geographic community, it's its own separate community within this kind of bigger geographic one. So why couldn't a recovery community organization exist on college campuses that just allowed people, whether they wanted to access services, feel safe and supported, just have conversation and be connected, just build community in a like-minded way without the impetus that there has to be an intervention or there has to be an agenda. There can be, right? But it just creates and normalizes and brings these elements of recovery community to environments that are often adverse to recovery, right? As we may know it, for a variety of different reasons. I think Bill White would call them hostile to recovery. And I don't think they're necessarily hostile to recovery. I think they're misinformed and lack motivation to support recovery, which has changed over the last 20 years, right? Yeah. But for us, it was less around can we intervene and make people better, right? But can we just create space that if somebody wants to change their relationship with their well-being, their health, their substance use, that they could have somewhere to talk about that, and everything else can branch off from that, direct services, recovery housing and college dorms. But it has to start with the idea that let's be informed and create space to even talk about these concepts, because that doesn't exist in many places, including college spaces.
Yeah.
So how did you do that? Your actual example, how did you create a space?
Yeah, so it's didn't take no for an answer, right? I'm pretty sure any of my advisors and many others, a lot of the things that we built have come off resentments, right, of not being able to, and I'll tell the story, and I have a whole lot of love for the Texas Tech recovery program, right? But from my experience, right, I was like, oh, this thing exists at Tech. It's one of the preeminent kind of CRPs in the country, and I remember, didn't hear directly, right, but asking him, how do you get involved in this? And the answer was, well, you have to have 6 months sober. And that never really resonated with me, right? Like, I need services and this support now. I've got 30 days. I want to go back to school. Like, I'm not just going to come and meet this arbitrary deadline, regardless of the rationale. Like, I need this community now. And that's, quite frankly, bullshit. So this idea, right, some of that resentment, which isn't always healthy, and I realize chips on shoulders are not conducive sometimes to the recovery process, but it did drive wanting to create something that was for everyone. So it's that passion and kind of drive, as well as just not taking no for an answer, finding other like-minded individuals, which is always a prerequisite in my mind to create anything, is you create momentum. You create enough momentum, enough people talking about it. Finding people with money certainly doesn't hurt, and you just begin demanding change. And I think that's what it took on our college campus at UNT, right, is finding some allies, some champions, finding other students. And then it got really strategic over the long term, right? It was a lot of work. It's not like it happens organically. I ended up running because we needed money, right? So we got a space. We had a faculty student champion that was saying, yes, we can create the student org. We created the Students for Recovery org. And they're like, well, shit, now we need money so people will take us seriously and we can pay staff, get dorms, et cetera. So we didn't have the luxury of having high-profile donors like a lot of CRPs do. We didn't get a whole lot of support from the alumni or development offices. They're like, what is recovery? No thanks. We don't want to fundraise for that. We got new buildings to build. So there was another outlet we found, and kind of looking at all the different university mechanisms, which was student service fees, right? Every part of tuition, you pay fees for services. And there was a mechanism to capture some of those student service fees through a committee that got appointed by the Student Senate. So I ran for a Student Senate seat. won and politically positioned myself to get a seat on that committee, and then won over some votes like you would do in advocacy and lobbying, and got a proposal approved for $200,000 a year in student service fee funding to fund the Collegiate Recovery Program, which is still in place today, and it's kind of the baseline funding they've had, and it's grown, donors, et cetera, since then. But it was a lot like a little mini episode of House of Cards, I guess, in a more positive light of just bootstrapping it together.
Yeah.
And just always showing up and saying, how can we create space for people to recover, and doing it.
I agree. I think I've done some really random things and didn't often know why I was doing this random thing, but there has been nuggets of gold that have come out of every single random thing. Mm-hmm. So,
and I think it's, there's not a roadmap. I mean, there's more now. There's toolkits, et cetera, right? But even 20 years, 22 years, however long we've been in this, y'all have been doing it even longer than me, probably longer than most. Like there's still not a tried and true, like do this, and you'll be successful. I think a lot of our tenacity as people in recovery is doing those random things, right? We just keep trying until something works. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the beauty of it sometimes. Like what worked for me, just like in my personal recovery, may not work for somebody else trying to do this. It's find what works in your community and just don't give up.
Yeah.
Just keep going.
I think a lot of RCOs run into the trap of the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So one of the things we've done at CCAR is when it doesn't work, we don't do it. I mean, as ridiculous as that sounds, it's really helped us. And I also think you're expressing the art of leadership. And I think Sandy has that art. I think I have that art. And the three of us could sit down and talk about our styles of leadership. There would be similarities, but there's differences. So that goes to your point about roadmaps. You can design a toolkit, but I'm always intrigued, like Don Coyhis from White Bison tells the story of like the recovery ritual that was on a Northwest tribes used this ritual, and it was water-based, whale-based, right? And it became an evidence-based practice, and they wondered why it didn't work in the desert. So, I mean, and that's our government sometimes, right? That this is now an evidence-based practice, but why doesn't it work in the desert? We have to, that's the art of developing RCOs too. There's some basic structure and building blocks that those of us that have been doing it for a while can point people to, but how you would implement it or roll it out, or even if you do, is completely up to you. So how did you, and I knew you from YPR because Courtney Level asked you to write a paper for us for our young people in recovery curriculum. But we've also we still run that on occasion, Young Adult Recovery Coach Academy. But it's we find the Recovery Coach Academy, the basics are so simple, and and cover so many skill sets that we tend not to design training for a population. We want to keep it generic and stuff to allow for the art of it. But talk to me more a little bit about your YPR experience and where that led you.
Yeah, it was right after I finished my undergrad, and I actually ended up leaving the program director of CRP to take, after volunteering, a paid role in staff and salary with YPR for their national program director, and it lasted probably about a year and a half. But it was a continuation of kind of this early work of what I think I took away most from it. Yes, there was certainly an advantage to designing more programs for more people. We built My Recovery is Epic, which was recovery workshop curriculums essentially for young people in recovery, and did chapter operations and tried to mobilize people. Many of this work, which is branched out to new organizations and more work and more advocates, in really helping young people in recovery get connected to the larger community. All of that was important, but I think the most meaningful work into that time, from volunteering and being staff and then moving on, was one of the biggest things to me, and I mentioned it earlier on, right, in my own recovery, is getting connected to the larger recovery community, and not just the larger recovery community in my hometown, right, which where, I entered recovery, that was like 5 old timers at, one 12-step meeting.
Yeah, right.
That is the first local recovery community, but it's always been important to me. And I think kind of the impetus for large scale change has been how large it actually is, right? And this started with getting connected on social media to different advocates and people in recovery and my early recovery and helping me. But then at YPR, that really kind of even accelerated more of seeing how big the recovery community actually is, from the West Coast to the East Coast, Mid-Atlantic to the Northwest, the frontier to the rural to the metropolitan and urban. And it's one of the things that I still love today about it is, our frame of reference is different, right? When we say in advocacy, right, there's 22.5 million people in long-term recovery, which is now based on the National Recovery Study data. That doesn't mean a whole lot until you start really meeting a whole lot of people and seeing them, when you can put faces with names and stories, when you start hearing thousands and thousands and thousands of stories and seeing why people do this work, it's no longer just a number, right? It's a very realistically large recovery community. And I think that changed a lot of my perspective of seeing just how big it was and how much community could be out there. And if you look at the life kind of span of my short career, which is coming up on a decade, where it exists now is really getting that to people really early on, right? We run digital recovery meetings at Unity. When you can go to a meeting with 200 other people, that changes your frame of perspective of who you're actually in this with. Who are you engaging in this process and building community with? Which there's nothing wrong with going to the small meeting with 5 people in person, right? There's something to that. It was beneficial, but there's something really magical in my experience of being connected almost instantly to a very large community. I'm not alone, and that was really important to me. And it has been probably every stage of my recovery. It has really influenced, I think, of how I perceive this. And YPR was a big catalyst for that, because it got me connected quick to a lot of people doing similar work with a whole lot of passion.
Mm-hmm. Unity Recovery. What's the story behind this? And I love that. Unity Recovery Community Organization. Why the name Unity?
So I will tell my version of it. My wife, who Ariel, who I mentioned before, is not here, is my partner in all things in life and parenting, and certainly in the work that we do in the community and business. She would say, and I'll start with that story because she'll maybe not let me enjoy life afterwards if I don't, but her favorite band is 311. Mm-hmm. And one of their albums and songs is around unity. So she always says, as we were walking in West Philly and saying, what if we start an RCO that took some of what you did in collegiate recovery and took my love of yoga and meditation, and we co-located those things together and just built an RCO for the community with yoga. And we can call it Unity because it's just the best album 311 has. That's what we're going to do. That's what she would say. Probably the truth, but the reality from my perspective is we chose Unity because it's been a big feature for how we try to bring people together, both in mental health and substance use recovery or co-occurring recovery, that these communities can be united, that we can have unity across people from different pathways and programs of and to recovery, whether that's pharmacotherapy or medication, whether it's harm reduction and moderation, whether it's traditional abstinence-based 12-step or SMART, whatever those may look like. But also, and I think we really do this today from the different ways we integrate the Unity Enterprises, which has the taco shop, the yoga studios, the soon-to-be coffee shop, and then also the RCO, is can we unify community, people in recovery, allies, and people that aren't those things. And a good example of what we mean by that is at the yoga studios, we do free community-based recovery yoga multiple times a week. Those are one offering, but the studios themselves are also just a traditional yoga and meditation studio. So we have people, that some may call quote unquote normies, right? They're not in recovery. They may have never had a behavioral health disorder, or at least would identify that way. And they're connecting with and building community with people in recovery. And it changes perspectives. It humanizes people in recovery that have so often been otherized, and says, we can, even if they would say, I've never met with somebody or had somebody in my life that identifies in this way, meaning in recovery, we change that, right? It changes people's perspectives without doing it with programmatic intention. It does it by bringing unity to a lot of different communities in spaces. So all of that is I think all of those different pieces of truly trying to unify different communities, perspectives, identities is why Unity Recovery.
So this is a great topic because I have just recently come to the conclusion in the work that I'm doing that we need to be much more intentional about including folks in recovery from mental health challenges, other behavioral health issues. And Phil has really led CCAR with being a little more mainstream around substance use disorders. And so we've had challenging conversations, but the population of young adults that I'm seeing all have co-occurring disorders. So I don't have a single student that I'm working with that doesn't. And there's such a deep need for young adults. What are some of the challenges, though, for being more inclusive with your RCO?
So I'll answer it in my way, and obviously I'm very biased, right? My entire identity and trajectory and professional work in this space has been around integrating these communities. So very, very biased. And the reality for me, in a practical sense, right, on the ground, doing this work with people, building these types of spaces, there's not challenges between people, especially if they're early on in recovery. Like if they don't know any different, if they don't know that there's this divide between mental health and substance use, and they just want recovery support and work with a peer, if they want to go to meetings, all recovery especially, if they want to do pro-social activities and do things without substances, not because they want or need to be abstinent, but just because it feels good, right, in building that. There is no barriers, right, to integrating these communities because there's no subconscious or conscious bias that may be proliferating through the larger context of the recovery community, which mental health and substance use, I think primarily driven by funding streams, have been said we need to fight each other. So that's the practical sense, and it's always my experience. It's my experience in CRPs and at Unity Recovery is people want to be inclusive of others, especially if that's all they've ever known. Now, in the programmatic sense, and we do draw a slight line because of where we have seen kind of ethical and service delivery obstacles, right? I'm a firm believer that mental health recovery support and substance use recovery support, from the perspective of peer-delivered services, nearly identical. Where some of the referrals you might make, if you're doing clinical referrals or housing, you may have some additional considerations, but how people work with people in that peer context and relationship, very similar, except for one caveat, which is severe and persistent mental illness. There seems to be more considerations there. And so we stay in our lane in that context of, we don't know all the times if we can be the most ethical service provider. We'll partner, we'll help people that have SPMI, but we don't. Providing that type of community, there has been issues there, right? And it's because peers aren't always qualified because it requires a really, oftentimes between psychiatry, medication, if that's the, chosen somebody's for SPMI, there can be a lot more there. And it's kind of like around crisis response, right? We've always said we're not crisis and suicidal ideation workers, et cetera, as peers. We can make referrals and partner and traverse that journey with you, but we're not a crisis response service, and it's the same with our SPMI. So I think those two, from a programmatic consideration and obstacles, have continued to be an issue in ways that we have not found to tackle, that we feel that we're providing ethical recovery support services to a range of populations. But even then, I think at the same time, if the underlying philosophy has to be, no matter who walks in my door, whether it's at my house, the RCO, who talks to the text line, I don't care what they're dealing with. Can I support this person in that moment? And then we'll figure out what they want. Do they want to become a part of the community? Great. You have a space and a seat here anytime you want it. What the support service and one-on-one looks like gets figured out later, right? But it's never turning anybody away. And I think it's important to me, and the Texas Tech story I said I think influences this, is how we position ourselves, right? If somebody lands on my website or gets told about me, if everything I say is I'm substance use, that person may not come in because they don't identify that way, even though we could have supported them or been a good partner. And I think those are always the things I want to avoid, right? Is that everybody belongs here because they get to decide why they belong. And can we build space for them?
Yeah, I don't need to explain, but you did mention that the focus on Connecticut Community for Addiction Recovery has been on addiction recovery. And that is born from the way the system was 22 plus years ago, that there were so many mental health services and advocates, there was nothing for support for the addiction recovery community. So over the years, we have just said that our focus is on addiction recovery. However, I can't think of a time that anybody's ever come into our center or into one of our services and we said, "You're not welcome here." Well, of course not. We say, "How can we help you with your recovery today? And what does recovery look like for you?" And then we'll go from there. We have also had the very similar experience, whether it's in one of our centers or a coach in the emergency department with serious and persistent mental illness. That's not our lane. We can be a comfort, we can coach, we can help, but sometimes we are not equipped for the right intervention at that time. Mm-hmm. And I love the way you framed that, Robert, of saying the ethical delivery of the service, right? And I don't know, I think we have enough people that we're seeing and helping that we just kind of have to be mindful of our lane, but we're also very giving. We err, ERR, on the side of generosity. And if someone's outside of our lane, we'll do everything we can to make sure that person receives appropriate and adequate help and care.
Yeah, I think that's and you write a lot about this too, right? As our field continues to grow, specifically to paraprofessional peer recovery support, recovery coaching, it's various different monikers, and there's still a lot of people that aren't really sure what it is. But I think it's important for those, just like we have to define and carve out and not get co-opted by the larger, kind of clinical and medical treatment system and how we interface with those things. It's also important to say at the same time where we're not, and be the one that says that. I think it's important for us as a field to say, to your point of what I mentioned, right, is where can we ethically deliver services? And that has to somewhat be our guiding true north, because if we don't, I think there's even more and more tendency, in addition to co-option, and say, well, we need peers because they're the hot buzzwords, but they're really now just behavioral health techs, which we don't have anymore. We just changed the job title. Right. But we also need to make sure that we're not everything for everyone, right? Because more and more I'm seeing, well, let's just get peers. They can solve all these problems. But that's not how you grow and sustain a new profession, a new side of the field. We need peers for what they do. What's in scope? What's in the job description? What are they trained to do? And since everybody's not going to, different organizations aren't going to necessarily do that, we have to do it, right? We have to say, no, that is not what I do, and have to feel comfortable in that statement. And I think RCOs play a really important role in that, because we're the experts in that, just like people in recovery are experts in their own lives. Mm-hmm. I still think to this day, RCOs are the experts in what peer services are, and we should be driving that conversation more and more.
Oh, you're singing my song, because I've always said that we are a separate field from clinical treatment, that we're here to maintain and sustain recovery, and clinical treatment's primary purpose is to initiate recovery. They have failed, as far as I can see, with the ongoing recovery support. It's like you go in and you're done. So 28 days, if you're lucky to get that. There's some long-term programs. But I think, and Bill White will talk about this, the failure of the treatment system was they were never able to adequately assign the proper dose for the severity of the addiction. So it was always one dose fits all. And what recovery support does is prolong the service for as long as the person decides they need it. There's no time frames or prescribed doses. I mean, even in the recovery community, it's 90 meetings in 90 days. And that's like the prescribed dose. Why do they assume that's for everyone? You can establish a good foundation, I'm sure, but so you're singing my song, and I just would love for us to figure out a way to come together and really have a strong national voice about the need for recovery support.
It's interesting, because I agree with you. You, even as somebody that was successful, again, in spite of systems, criminal justice, the treatment setting, the people I was connected to, those are the reason, I think, for my success, and with several other factors. But and while treatment has some culpability in that, I think the point I want to make is that can be true, but the reality is the way the mixed payer healthcare system in this country doesn't incentivize it. Doesn't incentivize
Correct.
treatment centers to provide or even think about individualized care. And regardless of our feelings, we live in a capitalist market. Financial incentives drive things. Value-based care has been talked about for 2 decades, and we have made very little progress on it. And it's the same side around recovery support, right? It's not funded. We should not have to go after discretionary grant dollars from SAMHSA in most states, or try to get scraps from the block grant, even if we get a 10% set aside, which I'm a huge support of if it goes to the right places. But CMS and private insurance companies, Medicaid populations, et cetera, I put most of the blame at them in terms of how they have set up the financial incentives and payment market for this. If recovery supports are reimbursed and easy to access capitated payments, if treatment centers were motivated to truly deliver individualized care and pay for success, this looks different overnight. And while we certainly partner with and do a lot of good work with treatment centers in Philadelphia in terms of we don't refer people, we send everybody to who can do clinical assessments and appropriate replacement of care, but we take their referrals of discharge. The ones that realize we can't do long-term recovery support well, we can do clinical well. Those ones are great, but they still do it without financial incentive to get everybody doing it. The market's got to change, right? So I think the person at the top of that is the federal government and CMS and payers. When they change what they pay for, because we value what we pay for, this changes.
Well, yeah, it sounds like I'm talking to like Greg Williams a little bit here. So, but
I was influenced by a lot of those in the YPR day. Certainly biased from my perspective.
But the other part to me is I've said now for 20 plus years that if the recovery community operates a viable, respectable recovery community organization, the recovery community will fund that RCO. And I would love to see the day where we are not beholden to public sources of money. And I think that's with your entrepreneurship, with little businesses you're running, and we do it with our training and other little things that we people in recovery are incredibly creative. The recovery community is creative. We'll figure it out. But again, the drive from a lot of national organizations is always about the block grant and the public funding and the state funding, and we are good partners with our state. I'm very appreciative of that. We've done a lot of good work, but ultimately we have to be like most nonprofits, and that's from the individual donor. That's where 90% of all nonprofit giving is from.
I think you're right? And we also are very appreciative of SAMHSA and HHS and our single state authority for all the money they give to the RCO. So I don't want to lambast them, right? But and it's also because I agree, and we're a little bit different because I still am looking for the right development director. Community giving is the least kind of diversified funding stream at Unity. It's our least largest bucket. It's the smallest, but we're also fairly new, right? We're 2.5 years old, but longer term, right? Our social enterprises, the taco shop, the yoga studios, because they're all structured as for-profit businesses that do funnel money back into, because we never charge for recovery supports like many RCOs, and that helps, right? And at scale, it can certainly work, but on some level, and I don't know the answer, right? But I don't feel like we should have to pay for our own recovery support, right? Like I don't know if the community should have to subsidize my delivery of recovery support because our tax dollars should be. Private insurance companies should cover this, that they're making billions and billions of dollars. Like I think it should be both, but I would rather community donations going to building community parks and services for the recovery community or things that are different than direct service, right? I would rather that no community has to subsidize recovery coaches because that stuff is a covered healthcare service. And I'm not saying they can't or they shouldn't. That money I wish could go to different things that can innovate in the recovery space because the other parts of our system fund this service as critical to health.
Well, you have a lot more faith in our government than our systems that they would actually like distribute the money equitably and not put people in a box and the service would.
I have no faith in that. So that's what I wish it would do. That's the world I want to live in. But I don't know if either of us will see it in our lifetime.
Yeah, I hear you.
So I'm super interested in hearing about the businesses that Unity has started.
Yeah, so we set out, and the first one was Ariel's idea around kind of building this idea of a traditional yoga and meditation studio that could be a business and support and give back in both free recovery yoga classes as well as a social enterprise, put profits or revenue back into the nonprofit. So we started with the idea and could it work? And it was largely successful. The first location we had the RCO was on the third floor and the yoga studio was on the second. It was our first. We did that and we opened it in 2019. COVID has obviously hit and we've experienced a lot of different growth, but what that looks like today is we have 2 yoga studios. The original one is both floors now. The RCO has moved on to a new 4,000 square foot recovery center just down the street on Main Street in Manayunk, which is a suburb of Philadelphia. We have a second yoga studio, which is same premise, doesn't have a co-located RCO anymore, but it does recovery yoga, social enterprise, connects community and these different stakeholder groups to learn about each other, but also makes money to then fund recovery support. And we've thought about it as we continue to grow of why couldn't we do more, right? Why couldn't we not only create revenue by building businesses that marketed to and catered and said, you know what, recovery community, we see you. Nobody else talks to you and wants you to spend your discretionary income. We would love to, right? Our marketing efforts, our materials, our spaces are recovery friendly. But the more part for us was, what if we start just employing people in recovery and returning from incarceration, paying a living wage, and really create this feedback loop of we can support initiating and supporting new recoveries. We can employ existing recoveries and pay them wages that they really can't find anywhere else. And we started that with the taco shop, and the recovery yoga studios have moved to that too. Nobody makes less than $15 an hour. Most make 19 or above at all of our locations. We employ just over, between the community center, the taco shop, the yoga studios, just over 100 people in recovery. The peers and the supervisors at the RCO make the most. Everybody makes salary at the RCO, and we are one of the highest paying peer jobs in the city, because what we found to really walk the walk and not just talk it, right, is we had to pay people living wages too, because Philadelphia, if nobody's aware and you're not familiar, is the poorest, largest metropolitan city in this country. And we kept hearing from the community, right, that job opportunity, growth, being respected, all the resources were great, but if we couldn't find jobs that really could see us and pay us well, what does it really matter, right? The despair around economic and impoverished conditions was large. So it became a true hallmark of what we're doing. And because of it, right, you got to think of the business sense, because these make money, they fund recovery supports. The community has responded to that. The amount of people that come in and say, my parents, my loved ones, my brother, my sister, I want to support this business. I want to eat good food, but also support a cause, has just been huge. When we first opened the yoga studio in 2019 with the RCO, we faced NIMBY, right? The syringe or the safe injection overdose prevention site conversation was booming in Philadelphia. We got a call from the development committee of Manayunk where we put we don't want you here. We know what you really are. And we had to do a lot of education around recovery support and RCOs and saying we support that. That's not us. But we have this yoga studio and great. And fast forward 3 years later, when we're opening these new ones, when we open the restaurant, people support us from the get-go. They said, we can't wait to have you here. And I think just in that short time frame of not only showing what's possible, right? Because people look at things that are successful and I learned something different, but we have changed entire communities right now, suburbs of Philly, saying, this is viable. I was wrong. We want you here and thanks for what you do. And we want to support you. And I think it's a little bit different than supporting nonprofits, right? Everybody likes to give if they can, but the reality is, and at least from my perspective with for-profit businesses, people like to get a good and service. They need to spend money. They really like spending discretionary income with businesses that support their values and their identities. So having marketing material like our tagline for the taco shop, and I'll end with this because we really wanted people to think, that they get it and it's funny and they're marketing to me. And it's maybe the first time I've seen that. So our tagline for the taco shop is 1 is too many, 1,000 is not enough, with giant pictures of tacos. And people like it, right? It's an insider joke. If you're in the know, but it also works really well. And so we've just had a lot of fun with it.
I so resonate with your concept of paying people a livable wage. And for 20 plus years, I've been saying, if we don't pay people in recovery well and value them, then who will? And so we have to set the standard of, so our emergency department recovery coaches are the highest paid coaches in our state. And I still don't think they make enough for the work they do. I'd like to pay them more.
Absolutely.
And so kudos to you. That is just really cool stuff. I know that Unity Recovery is a platinum sponsor for Multiple Pathways of Recovery Conference in Punta Gorda. So appreciative of your support next year, 2022. Talk to me about your involvement with Multiple Pathways and why you chose to get involved and anything you see about that coming up.
Yeah, and I think of a lot of reasons. One, as we've grown and been successful over the last 2 years, we're finally in a position where we can really start to give back. And I appreciate the kudos to me, but I would be remiss if I didn't really extend how we've been able to be successful, which one is certainly my wife and family, but more importantly is those 100+ people that we employ. Mm-hmm. And one in particular who's not on, but will be at the conference, Adam Sled, who's our RSS director at the RCO, because I hired him with an IOU saying, hey, we have $20 in the bank. I'm going to get this money. Can you please come work for us? And I will make sure you get paid, even though I have to pay you out of my own pocket. And a lot of grants and success later. He's really grown with us. But people believing in us, the kudos is really to them, because none of this would be possible without them. So, but now that we've had a lot of success and are in a position to support back, we talk collectively as a team of what different initiatives around the country, whether it's conferences or events, can we put some of these resources in to begin to continue to elevate them? And this is no smoke that everybody's conference that everybody has wanted to go to that can't amongst the RCO staff was Multiple Pathways. And I think it's the work that y'all have done there. It's made a name of truly being recovery centric. It's not like a recovery track at the treatment conference. Mm-hmm. And I think that matters, right? That it's for us, by us. And I think that resonates certainly with our staff. I will say somewhat selfishly, and why I'm excited is because I have never gotten to meet Bill White in person. And I don't know if I will or not, but it's the only one he goes to since it's local to him. And it's that kind of stuff, the content that comes out, hearing Bill talk at it in the past years, the people that you speak out, and that it's catered to what we do. It was a no-brainer for us. And I think that kudos goes to you and your team of being able to put this event together each year so that we even had something that we feel good about supporting. And it's different than supporting other conferences. I think, I'm not going there to increase my bed count or my census or anything else. I just want to give back to the recovery community so that more people can get access. And that feels good to support. And I think that's why we chose this one and our staff did versus sponsoring some other event that we go table at and hope we can get 50 participants, because that's just not how we do things.
Right. And I love what you said about meeting Bill White. That's why we do have it in Punta Gorda. January 12th through the 14th in 2022. But it's also Bill goes because Don Coyes goes. Don Coyes goes because Bill goes. And so they have this little reunion. So you'll see them off in the corner talking, and they'll let people in. But a lot of people just understand what they're doing. And then I get the chance to facilitate a little question and answer center. And I see them really as the elders of our tribe, if you will, in a lot of ways. Bill's like the brains and Don's the heart. And now we're going to bring in Jan Brown, who's probably the soul. So it's going to be a fascinating session. I do appreciate the concept of multiple pathways, because in recovery coaching, we were talking about that all the time. So we wanted to hold a conference. What are those? And then we only see our role, CCAR's role, as conveners. We're not here to push any agenda except maybe the multiple pathways. And then you guys come in and talk among yourselves. And if something develops out of this, that we get some other momentum in some direction, then so be it. But it's certainly not me or CCAR driving that. It's the spirit of recovery, if you will, the recovery community that will drive whatever comes out of it.
It's the beauty of all the things we do, right? Is we comes down to that ultimate truth. We create space for people, and the things that can happen when you create that space is just magical.
Right. And Sandy and I, we still have to work on this, though.
Yeah, I've actually asked him if we could prepare for something for a change, because we'll be doing the final session. And I
like winging it too. So
I'm a preparer, and he's not. So,
but I do know what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about our Appalachian Trail adventure, right?
That's what
Trail
I've been
Talk.
told.
That's
Trail
what
Talk.
So that's cool. So as we wrap up, Robert, what do you see as the future? What are you looking forward to? And let me ask you, how old were you when you got into recovery?
25.
And how old are you now?
I just turned 34. I'm either 34 or 35, and I can't remember. I had a birthday about 2 weeks ago. So.
Oh, okay. So that was young, and you've been very, obviously, incredibly passionate, and I'm so proud of what you've done. I mean, I'm just, I'm starting to become on the other end of this movement, as I'm up there and been around for a while, but to see young, passionate advocates like yourself touches my heart. I'm so grateful that you're in this role and doing this work. So I wanted you to, and I didn't hear this a lot when I was a kid growing up, but I want to encourage you by telling you 4 words from the bottom of my heart, is that I believe in you. And I mean that with all my heart, because I do. I believe in you. I believe in what you've built with your wife, with this, and I just encourage you to continue. And if you look in the near future, what do you hope to accomplish? What are the next doors you want to walk through?
It's a good question. Mm-hmm. I think that positive manifestation is something I certainly look at my life. And I think when I think future in a lot of different ways of where we invest in, it's certainly these overall goals of how do we continue to innovate and create systems and communities that truly see and support people in recovery. I think I'll speak to a different sense of not what I want to accomplish, but what I see as the future, which for me is digital recovery support. I am a huge believer in this idea of if billions aren't coming, right? If rural Wyoming needs recovery support, some of the best ways to do that in fast and just large scale ways is connecting people digitally with recovery support services, to meetings, to recovery yoga, meditation, all of the different elements of recovery support that have been beneficial to various individuals in their own pathways. We can do that at scale with limited resources in really cool ways. And I'm sure it's no surprise to y'all both at Unity, my work at Recovery Link, the tech company we founded. We're kind of going all in on that. I mean, it doesn't mean that there's not a lack of, high speed internet access isn't a utility yet. It's still a commodity. There's a lot of advocacy work to do there, but the amount of progress we've seen over the last 2 years, the amount of people, because due to COVID, that I've gotten to meet through digital recovery support, all recovery meetings, the 1 million people that have come to those over the last 2 years that have initiated recovery there that may have never had the opportunity to do so without it, it's just been inspiring. So I don't know if it's right. I think there will always be a place for all, just like multiple pathways, all forms. We're not going to give up on face-to-face and brick and mortar. That's important, but I hope the future looks a whole lot more like digital becoming very popular because it's easy and we can create equitable access in ways we never have been able to before. So hopefully we get to talk in 5 years and that will be a reality. And I think it's starting to come true, but I'm really looking forward to that effort. And I'll say, just because not a whole lot of people have ever said they believe in me. And I hope, thank you for all the work that y'all have done, right? The only reason I've been successful and others like me that are younger that have been able to start RCOs, create spaces, is because people started this work before us, right? And I think the other part, because of that I hope to get to do in the future, is that I get to say those words to somebody else when I'm 20 years from now, right? And that I get to inspire people like they inspired me. And as I'm getting older, I'm starting to realize that more leadership transitions. Who are the next people that are 25 now? And I'm not so sure how to do that yet, but I hope I figure it out because it's important. And I don't want the line to continue after us and to be able to inspire people like everybody like y'all have inspired us. So hopefully.
Well, the number one goal of a leader, Robert, is to create other leaders. And I already see you doing that. I mean, just your little story about Adam gave him an opportunity but helped you and you helped him. So you're creating leaders left and right. And think of the 100 people that are employed with you. And Art Woodard always asks this question in the Recovery Coach Academy: would you rather live your life or lead your life? And so you're providing opportunities every day for people to lead their own lives. You're creating leaders.
Well said.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a pleasure getting to know you, and I look forward to seeing you in Florida.
Likewise. Yeah, and I am hoping and can't wait for the day my daughter gets vaccinated and we can travel and see more people in the recovery community always, but we are looking very much forward to January. So thank y'all.
Thank you, Robert.